And now for an official welcome to today's event, I'd like to turn it over to Janice Roby, Chair of the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. Janice?
Thanks, Jessica. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for joining today's panel discussion. I'm here in my capacity as chair of the College of Computer, Math, and Natural Sciences Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Council, which was created last fall by CMNS Dean Varshney. Our council is very proud to co-sponsor today's event, which I understand has almost 500 registrants. It is our hope that this film and the ensuing discussion that we have today will raise awareness of our community of the important need to identify, call out, and work hard to reduce bias in the artificial intelligence technologies we are creating and using. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, and I want to especially thank Kate Atchison, who spearheaded the effort to bring this film to us on campus. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Katie Whitehead, CMNS Director for C, to say a few words.
Hello, everyone. My name is Katie, and I am the Cinema Director for Student Entertainment Events. C is a student programming board on campus, and we are super excited to be co-sponsoring this incredible and important event. I would now like to turn it over to Jan Plain, the Director for the Irab Initiative for Inclusion and Diversity in Computing and the Maryland Center for Women in Computing.
Thank you all for being here. Like she said, I'm the director of I4C and MICWIC, and we are really excited to be co-sponsoring this event because our main goal on campus is to bring more diversity to computing and to make sure it is an inclusive environment. And so I'm pleased to introduce Hale Daumé, who is a professor of computer science with joint appointments in the University of Maryland Institute for Advanced Computer Studies and the Language Science Center. And he has been active in the research involving bias and fairness in machine learning and AI. So Hal, it's up to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jan, for the introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here. I think we have just an amazing set of panelists to discuss this movie with. Hopefully, everyone has had a chance to see the movie. I think I've now seen it 2 or 3 times, and I feel like I learn something new every time. So it'll be available on the link that everyone has through Monday, and then it'll soon be coming out on Netflix, so you can also see it there. As a reminder, if you have questions that you'd like the panelists to address, please post them on the Slido. Just to minimize the number of sources I have to look at, I'd appreciate if people use that rather than the Zoom QA interface. But we definitely would love to hear questions, both based on your reaction to the movie, as well as questions in reaction to things that come up in the discussion with the panelists. So maybe let me start by introducing the panelists. So I'll start with our external member. So Deborah Raji is a fellow at Mozilla. You may also recognize her from the film. Then our second panelist is Margrét Bjarnadóttir. So she's an associate professor of decision operations and information technologies in the Smith School of Business here at University of Maryland. Next, we have Nicole Turner Lee. She's a sociology lecturer here at UMD and a Brookings Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and the director of the Center for Technology Innovation. And then finally, we have Adam Wenchel, who is an alum of the computer science program here at UMD. He graduated in 1999, and he's the co-founder and CEO of Arthur AI. So I think before we start, these are sort of your micro bios, but I'd like to just go around in a circle and maybe have everyone say a minute or two about what your relation is to this space of bias and ethics in AI, and what sort of angles you approach this problem from, just so that we have a sense of who's here and who we're talking to. So I think we can start in the same order I went through. So Deb, maybe you can go first.
Yeah, thank you. I kind of approach this from more of an engineering perspective. So I actually, was on an applied machine learning team, thinking I would be sort of on the side of building these systems. And I actually noticed while I was sort of on that team, a lot of the ethical questions that were coming up, and just how ill-equipped the team was to think through some of these problems, or just how uninterested some members of the team were in terms of like addressing these issues. So it really drove me to care a lot more about, to first of all, connect with Joy the first time a couple of years ago, and get involved in her work through the Algorithmic Justice League. But it also drove me towards this broader field of thinking about fairness in machine learning, and learning more about, what can be done to support people on the engineering side that might not really understand the issue, and thus don't feel that they're equipped to address the issue, they don't feel motivated to learn more about how to address the issue. So a lot of my work, since Gender Shades, I was kind of involved with Gender Shades as like an AJL intern. Joy likes to call me Agent Deb. So I was involved in the Gender Shades project, doing a lot of like data science work for her at that point. And then, the summer after I left the company I was at, I ended up kind of engaged more thinking about like audit practice and what we can do to sort of help people at these companies that are not aware of these issues or not understanding these issues, to really begin to, one, sort of grasp the importance of tackling these challenges, and two, kind of approach the problem systematically. So, I've also been involved with a lot of efforts at Google in terms of documentation practice, and I believe that's one way forward. But also just through my work with Joy, I've been thinking a lot about how to structure audits and different strategies for auditing, even as a third-party external auditor. So that's a lot of my work with Mozilla, has been really working really closely with Joy at the Algorithmic Justice League and thinking through some of these problems.
Thanks, that's wonderful. Let's continue on with Margrét.
Sure. Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me on this panel. So my background is actually in building these algorithms. So I've been involved in building algorithms in healthcare and in people analytics for, close to 15 years now. So my dissertation was focused on how do we utilize healthcare claims data to improve decision-making. For example, how do we surveillance drugs once they get approved to the market for side effects that are not discovered during the initial review, for example. And more recently, as the whole field of predictive analytics has been moving, I've been really focused on thinking about and educating my students about how do we think and frame, building these powerful tools in terms of ethics and bias, and trying to avoid the pitfalls, but reap the benefits of these tools.
Wonderful, thank you. So maybe next we'll stay in order and go with Nicole.
Well, hello, everybody, and happy Friday. Thanks for having me, Hal, and the UMD team. So I am the senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, the director of the Center for Technology Innovation there. I'm a sociologist, I'm not a computer scientist. Some may wonder, why would a social scientist want to sit alongside and actually have these conversations when it comes to machine learning algorithms? Well, my work generally actually intersects race, social justice, and technology. And as a result of that, I actually have really watched over the last few years just how the evolution of machine learning models have actually impacted, or have the possibility of further impacting, the systemic inequalities that already exist in the world. So I'll give you a really good example of when I became most interested in this. And that was when I was about 5 or 6 years ago, sitting with Dr. LaTanya Sweeney, who was at the time the Chief Technology Officer at the Federal Trade Commission. And she showed a video. And again, this is 5 or 6 years ago. I'm not going to date myself, Hal, but I'm going to share the story because I think it's really poignant, of a Black fraternity that was celebrating its 100th anniversary. And she told the audience members just to look carefully at that screen without blinking. And that's what we did. And within 2 to 3 seconds, that same website that was commemorating the 100th anniversary of a Black fraternity began to show ads of arrest records for Black men, as well as other predatory advertising that essentially made it very biased. And from there, it came to my understanding that there are sociological implications to technology. And so what I do in this space is I really just work on issues that try to combine the technical cadence. So what do technologists do in this space that really are all about the variables, the inputs, and potentially the outputs? What do policymakers think about this space when it comes to the type of civil rights laws that actually govern our need to not just have responsible AI, but lawful AI? And how does civil society actually engage? Where do people of color fit when algorithms essentially go wrong or are coded with bias? And so I sort of start this conversation as a sociologist from a structural perspective, that we start with bias from the onset because we bring our values, norms, and assumptions to the table. And then somewhere along the line, if unchecked on particular use cases like housing, credit, and I know we're going to talk about all those areas, we actually run the risk of creating and sustaining the systemic inequalities. So I've known Joy for quite some time. She and I recently just testified at the FTC, or one of the hearings that they held. But I'm a huge girl fan of hers as a sociologist, and just like Deb, I don't stay in that space. In fact, the last time I hung out with a lot of technologists, I wrote a paper with an engineer, and it was the longest paper of my life, just simply because we couldn't agree on anything. But it was also the best paper because in my work, I really try to contextualize the way that we could work together to solve these problems.
Wonderful, thank you, Nicole. And last but not least, Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Hal. My name is Adam Wenchel. As Hal mentioned, I did graduate from the University of Maryland and went to work at DARPA in the late 90s, doing AI, working on AI projects back when it was all very much a science experiment, and commercial applications were almost non-existent. And from there, I went into work for various startups, and which culminated in founding a startup that was acquired by Capital One in 2015. And so I joined Capital One, and shortly thereafter was asked to start their AI team and scale it up and really kind of help map out their AI strategy. And I think that was the time, when I really, number one, it was the first time I had the opportunity to really deploy AI in a way that was affecting millions of people's lives and also, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of revenue and like all these things. So it was very sensitive, right? And so as we were thinking about, the banking industry and the credit industry, there's all this history there that around like deciding who gets auto loans or credit cards or home loans and how much they're approved for. And so I became very sort of conscious of that as we were deploying these systems, and gave a talk actually in 2016 on this at a big AI event in New York that ended up at a big industry conference that got covered in the press and definitely sparked some conversation. And so, what I found both at Capital One with a lot of the companies that we work with at my current company, Arthur, is that the good news is, like, I think a lot of the work, like having, the Coded Bias movie and like the general kind of discourse that's been that's come to light in the last year or two, really kind of entered the public consciousness, has permeated corporate America. And a lot of these companies actually really are eager and genuine about wanting to become more equitable and make sure they're doing a good job. It's just really hard and they don't know where to start. And so, when I left Capital One, I founded a new company called Arthur that was specifically aimed at helping companies have a really pragmatic approach to beginning to address some of these problems. And certainly there's huge parts of it that are organizational. It's not all just, it can be solved with technical solutions, but we are working with them to kind of provide at least a piece of the puzzle to help them, deploy AI in a more responsible way.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So I think this is super exciting because, we all come from somewhat different backgrounds, have different expertise. And so I want to try to pick up on questions that are going to be sort of interesting from this multidisciplinary process. So one of the things that comes up several times in this movie is around this question of sort of accountability or due process of algorithmic systems. So, the example that stuck with me was the example of the teacher, Mr. Santos, who is essentially being fired despite all of his commendations as a wonderful teacher, and the fact that it was really unclear what he could do about this, right? So at the end of the movie, this is sort of left unresolved. In fact, I don't know if it's resolved or not. If someone knows, they can certainly chime in. But I'd like to hear your thoughts from your various perspectives about what does accountability look like for algorithmic decision-making systems, where does the onus lie? And, for maybe people, well, on either of the sides of the technology spectrum, like, are there big technological gaps that we need to address to get there? So I'm going to sort of shift order that we go through so that it's not always the same person first. So this time, let's start with Margrét.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, I think you bring up such an important question, because the question is, if we are using algorithms to make these decisions, and if they are a black box, where does the responsibility lie? Does it lie with the decision maker that is, ultimately signing off on the decision, or does it actually lie with the builder of the black box, right? So I think, if you think about it from kind of, these businesses, so I sit in the business school, so I'm going to put my business hat on. So if you think about this from the business perspective, if I'm a startup or an organization providing these solutions, and I provide them as black boxes, meaning I'm not providing any transparency into how the box makes the decision, we are putting the decision maker in a very difficult position, right? So then the question is, where does the responsibility lie? And in my mind, it has to be then with the, whoever built the black box. So I think, especially as the movie so clearly demonstrates, in these decision-making scenarios that are affecting our lives, so whether it's our livelihood or whether we get probation, we need to put on the requirement of transparency on these black boxes. We cannot just simply accept them as magic and then apply them to our decision-making. And even if the suggestions of these systems are just suggestions, right? They're supposed to support decision-making. We know from research that, once we have a suggestion, it biases our thinking, right? So it's one piece of evidence. And if it's the computer that told me this evidence, I take it very seriously, right? So in my mind, the big question here is, or the responsibility that we have to start shifting, is on the providers of these algorithms to actually provide transparency. And that goes again, so interestingly, that's, for example, what the legislation in New York is now doing. There's the requirement of those that are making decisions based on algorithms to actually be able to provide explanation. And similar things happening in Europe. So I think we are moving in that direction.
Yeah, and at this point, I think we'll just open it up. So if anyone has thoughts or wants to respond to Margrét, please just unmute and go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually, I didn't want to force you to go in the same order twice, but yeah, I have a little bit of context just because the Algorithmic Justice League did work very closely with Daniel Santos. And this was sort of part of like a larger case with the Houston Federation of Teachers. And they actually ended up bringing a lawsuit to the school board. And that's not like, it's not clear cut what the outcome of that will be, but they actually have sort of pursued legal action. And this was one of the sort of cases highlighted in an event that the AI Now Institute at New York University, where I was a fellow for about a year, they had an event called Litigating Algorithms, where they talked through some of these sort of strategic litigation cases where individuals that felt like they were harmed by an algorithm have actually begun bringing forth civil suits and trying to get justice by themselves. And, it kind of paves a path towards potential, proposals that can be made for policy making. So it's kind of a strategy of strategic litigation is something that's been embraced, by the AI Now Institute and by other groups that are looking to have these, there's also Data and Society also released sort of a report called Poverty Logarithms, where they talk about, similar strategic litigation cases in the in the use of algorithms in social services and child welfare and things like that. So, people are really trying to find accountability through legal action. And I think that's a very reasonable place to look. To speak to the comments that were just made around who is accountable, I think that's a huge issue with algorithms where, when an algorithm when a human discriminates as part of a process, you can kind of say, the way anti-discrimination law is sort of structured in the US and in Canada is kind of around the intent to discriminate. So if a human doesn't hire you because you're Black and you have some insight into the fact that that's the reason that they did that and they had that intent to discriminate, then that's sort of the grounds through which you can sue this person, or you can claim protection under anti-discrimination law. But with algorithms, it's a machine, it doesn't have any intent. So, where does that discrimination come from and who should be held accountable? I think there's some people, me included, who really do see, a lot of accountability, on the shoulders of the vendors. Like, I do think the way that machine learning models are created today, they're not very robustly constructed. So they make a lot of mistakes. They're not necessarily thoroughly tested for all these different populations. So I do think like a lot of the machine learning or AI products, things that are marketed as AI products that are out there in the world today, are really dangerous and kind of prematurely deployed. And the vendors should be responsible for that. But there's also a lot of situations, and this is something that I realized when looking at facial recognition deployments, where the operator, like the person that sort of purchases the vendor's product, can also kind of use it for a malicious use case. So you can think of like police maybe targeting a particular community using an algorithm or a facial recognition or other surveillance tool. And there's some accountability for the person that's making use of this algorithm for some end, or maybe there should be some accountability for a public agency making use of an algorithm without a procurement process that looks at all the details of that algorithm or asks these questions around, is that product suitable, or is that product thoroughly built, or maybe the sort of agency should be the one vetting that product, and it should be on the agency or the operator to have made a better decision. So it's really unclear sort of who is accountable when. Another thing that really frustrates me about accountability is that I understand the need to sort of talk about, those that create the algorithms as the ones that need to be accountable. And I agree with that. But there's also a challenge of, sometimes who they're building the algorithm for is not the person that's affected. And I keep seeing this as like a recurring pattern where, you'll be building algorithms for, school administrators or for doctors or for, police officers, and it'll really be affecting students or patients, or a community that has, that is so removed from the process, that isn't paying anyone any money, that's just kind of out of the loop of, the entire ecosystem of stakeholders they're considering. So I think, in those situations, it becomes really dangerous to sort of talk about what companies can do, or talk about self-regulation, because the companies almost have no interest to sort of care about these like non-customers, these non-users that are still affected by their products. So yeah, all this to say, open question, incredibly complicated question, and one that keeps me up at night for sure.
Well, I'll jump in, and I like the way it's been framed so far in terms of the accountability. So I live in Washington on the policy side.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really clear from the policy side that there is accountability when the determination itself, much like Adam said, leads to either differential treatment or disparate impact. So when you have similarly situated people, places, and objects in a lending decision, and one gets it and one doesn't, because not necessarily because the model is flawed, but the iterative nature of an algorithm picks up all the other stuff about that individual and is able to actually creep into areas that are not necessarily federally protected, that's a problem, right? Because that means that there are foreclosed opportunities and consequences on particular communities. And we can't really have that because, unfortunately, people fail to realize that in the 1960s that people fought for civil rights, and that should not go just because, technology has come in and made our lives more efficient. It just shouldn't happen that way. So I think to that extent, it's really clear, at least in my work, that there has to be a framework that starts out with lawfulness. So people often talk about responsibility, they talk about explainability. I try to add in inclusiveness as well as lawfulness. And there's a question as to the extent, and this kind of goes back to what you were talking about as well, Deb, which is what are the use cases that we care about? clearly, and I think I'm speaking to all my engineer friends and computer scientists, there are just some decisions we don't care about. What movie Netflix recommends to you at 10 o'clock at night after you've watched every melodrama may not be an issue. Technically, I'll tell you this, not to be too deep, it's only an issue when you ain't got nothing else to watch because they've recommended everything that's in Netflix, right? So there's not enough original content. That's a whole nother conversation, Al, no whole nother issue. But when we start to look at, I think people like researchers at UMD, as well as, researchers have been working on like Joy and others, where there's an overlay of the inferential economy. I always tell people this, like, I'm a Black woman. I like to shop, and I love to shop so much that, the stores that I shop at are very good at targeting and micro-targeting ads towards me. But there's also this thing, if let's say they figure out in my shopping that I'm a mother, and I have a daughter, and then let's say they figure out that I shop too much and I'm always checking my credit. And then let's say they figure out that there are these other variables and all of a sudden I'm getting higher interest credit card loans. LaTanya Sweeney's work again says that Black sounding names, Latina sounding names, people who even click the credit card offering because of the power of the algorithm will not necessarily see anything else. And that to me is the most powerful thing about the movie, but it's really the powerful thing about this conversation. We've created a community, a technology where the accountability is so opaque that we sort of thrown up our hands and felt like, well, we cannot process it under the due process of the law. I think that that's false. So I would just say to the question, accountability looks like sort of what part of it are you looking at? Are you looking at inputs? Are you looking at outputs? What use cases actually you care about? Is it differential treatment because two variables act differently in different scenarios based on the context in which they're deployed? Or are you looking at, and I think Adam could attest to his work at Capital One, because I've interviewed bankers who use algorithms, which is all around disparate impact. So what's a litmus test for certain proxies that may actually replicate though and violate the Fair Credit Act? And I think that's when you start to get companies, really the accountability lies, because companies should not find themselves with reputational risk or high liability in the space, because at the end of the day, they should want their algorithms to perform equally and equitably across populations. That's the first thing. So that to me, on the last part of it, I would just say the interesting technical problems that become, how do you get there? And I would just say this because I now have the privilege of talking to computer scientists. Not every algorithm is going to be blind, and not every model can be desensitized to that blindness. So I often tell people, I think it's important from a sociological perspective, that if we're developing algorithms that are going to basically be based on automatically externally flawed historical systems, then we need to just acknowledge that. When you build an algorithm for the criminal justice system, when you rely upon training data that is potentially overrepresented by Blacks and Latinos, I don't care how efficient the algorithm will be. It may actually be efficient to the point of 1% to 2%, but it's still overlaying on an automatically flawed system. And so what I try to get folks in my line of work to realize is, without the interdisciplinary conversation, it becomes really hard to figure out where people like me should come into the mix and what role we should play in sort of co-creating some of these algorithms that have sensitive use cases. So I think that's where I would push it, Hal, in terms of like technical cadence. How do you begin to look at the discrete environment of math, overlay it within the context in which these models are deployed, and in certain use cases, have the conversation around that automated decision and its predictive capacity to make sure that the trade-off that you're making is not contributing to more unfairness. I sound like a Black Baptist preacher, but I am. That's what I do. It's Friday night. You got me at the tail end of the week.
I wanted to also add, I don't want to have this part of the conversation drag on for too long, but Nicole's point around policy and thank you so much for that work, by the way, because it's incredibly important to have people in Washington doing that work. Just sort of reminds me of like early conversations we had around gender shades, where there had been at that point a couple sort of like quite a few sort of like algorithmic auditing works of like online platforms in the HCI space. And one of the things that we were actively trying to think about with the design of gender shades was, how do we actually get this to translate to some kind of corporate response? Like, how do we go from this being just another paper, pointing to a problem, to actually getting, the attention of some of these companies to actually evolve, the situation around these systems, kind of like what you mentioned. There should be some kind of, reputational risk or liability tied to underperforming on different groups that you're claiming to serve. So yeah, I definitely think policy will play a big role in that. And I think the way we designed the gender shades audit was like super focused. I remember, later on, especially even reflecting on gender shades, me and Joy had a lot of conversations around, like the role of, public pressure and what it means to communicate the results to the public. Joy put a lot of thought into how she communicates those results. And I don't think, I think people kind of take it for granted, but there's a lot of thought that went into, how you visualize some of those differences, how you communicate those results in a way that really pushes people to care about this issue and either demand policy change or demand corporate action. So I just wanted to put that point in there that, going from audit to accountability is actually this, serious and real challenge. Oh, I think you're muted.
Adam, it looks like you unmuted. Do you want to add?
Oh no, I was just going to agree with all those points. I think really grateful for the role that people who are advocates and activists are play in this, and I think that work is so important. Personally, like I'm much more of like the behind the scenes, much more comfortable operating behind the scenes, and that tends to be where I come in. But I think it's like you really have to kind of approach it from all angles when you do it. But and on the regulation front, it's amazing that as Nicole said, there in financial services there is like a long history of anti-discrimination laws, but even there, like the regulation is so far behind what the kind of realities the technology has created, because there's been so much sort of innovation in the last 10 years. One of the examples there is like right now the sort of the paradigm in financial services in the US is this sort of fairness through unawareness, where they're not allowed to collect any data, and they sort of very intentionally don't collect protected class data. And the thinking when that kind of regulation was put in place was that you couldn't possibly be biased if you didn't have that data. And we now know that's not true at all. It's not even close to true. But yet, because this has been done a particular way for decades, it's really hard to affect change and like have them like all of a sudden start collecting it in a way that still protects people but allows them to measure disparate impact and the model's accuracy against different groups. And so unwinding that is a multi-year journey. Meanwhile, like the technology is already there, right? And so it's a really thorny problem right now, and there's a lot. I definitely believe that that public pressure is really helpful in terms of getting the regulators and lawmakers to move with the alacrity that the situation requires right now.
Yeah, so I wanted to pick up on something that Deb mentioned, which is this notion that a lot of these AI technologies are designed with one stakeholder in mind, typically the person in power in whatever the power dynamic situation is. There have been some examples of this being flipped. So like one that was mentioned is using facial recognition technology to identify faces of police officers who have removed their badges. There are probably other examples. I guess that someone mentioned in the Slido facial recognition also being used to identify some of the January 6th Capitol rioters. And so, I think people here represent a broad spectrum of technology areas. And I'm curious if you're aware of, or if you can think of other examples where sort of the AI technology is being used to sort of give power to the people rather than power to the state or the corporation or whoever is sort of on the upside of the power dynamic. Maybe we can start with Nicole this time.
Yeah, that's a hard question, because I think if you look at the disproportionate representation of diversity in the work teams that are actually driving the technology, it's very difficult to sit back and say that there is a push towards, this upside of tech AI when you don't have representative people there. And I think most of us are familiar with Google's recent firings of people, and that disheartens you, because you know, to Adam's point, that there are companies that are finding themselves on the front page of the newspaper, and many companies that are starting to put in fairness teams to sort of look at these issues. But the challenge is if you don't have people who have the lived experiences of groups that are on your team, it actually changes the nature and scope of the technologies being deployed. So I keep going back with legislators, for example, and civil society groups, et cetera. There are certain things that are innocuous that we may not place as much value on, but then there are other areas that we need to sort of figure out what that looks like. And as a result of the type of historical information surveillance that we've seen in communities, just take the January 6th insurrection, for example. So I have found it very interesting that facial recognition technology, in addition to increased social media surveillance, has led to the identification of these insurrectionists. Now, just 3 months prior or 4 months prior, a Black man in Detroit was walking down the street and was picked up by the police and held in the police station for 6 hours, misidentified and released as if, it was commonplace. And that, for me, really presents an interesting quagmire because as many people have advocated for bans, including, some of my peers, there's something in me that says, I don't know if I want this completely banned. I want it to be better. Because that type of mismatch suggests to me that, again, the algorithm is not performing across a variety of contexts. I should not, as a Black woman, be told that the algorithm doesn't pick up on me if I don't have the right lighting or if I change my hair. Either disclose that to me or, as Adam said, tell me when you're going to take my picture. Let's work together to co-evolve the technology, but do not sort of shortchange me on innovation simply because you don't have enough people around you that can help you in that experimentation. So to your point, there are obviously very interesting use cases of AI. The vaccination that some of us are getting has been a result of the upside of artificial intelligence systems. What we actually see when it comes to the launch of autonomous vehicles, when the United States compares itself to other countries, a lot of it has to do with the type of ingenuity that comes out of our American universities and our private corporations. But what I think many of us are saying is, how do we make it fair? And how do we make it equity deployed? So I'm not a pessimist, I'm a researcher. So we don't take side in either way because we're not partisan, et cetera. But what we try to do is we try to get people to understand that for the upside of the use of technology, there are blind spots. And these blind spots, I think, just degrade the quality and the application, the potential of these technologies if you're just not making it work for folks. And I love the way it was mentioned earlier, like we may be talking about facial recognition with law enforcement, and we're actually doing a project right now, Brookings, on this, but these same technologies creep into commercial applications. So it's not like they sit just in law enforcement, they're showing up on your phone, so you have to sort of think about, when we don't get it right overall, we're basically suggesting, that we're sort of, I think somebody put it, it's a lazy approach to how we look at artificial intelligence development. And I think that for sociologists, I see it, just in the conversations that I've been having with people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I look at right now the innovation that's happening. I tell people all the time, like, if we kind of take that lazy approach, it's going to just not only going to perpetuate the bias, like in some ways it makes it worse because it just automates it. And but yet at the same time, I do believe that there's also an opportunity to kind of like, if you take the opposite of a lazy approach, a really thoughtful approach, actually come up with a system and decision-making processes around healthcare decisioning and employment decisioning and people analytics in a way that, some people analytics in a way that, it actually reduces bias. And so like, I really feel like we're at this pivotal period in our history where, if the kind of there's increased continued awareness of these issues and people really, drive kind of the need for change and regulation and in corporate America, like we could come away with this actually being good for society, but it's going to take a lot of people pushing to make that happen.
Yeah, and I think something, I'm not sure if Hal was like purposefully alluding to this, but the conversation was sort of reminding me about, the recent kind of revelation or realization that's kind of happening in the fact, fairness, accountability, transparency space in research, where people are really recognizing the role of power and how power dynamics play out in terms of, whose concerns are addressed, how we're talking about this and how we're having this conversation. I think Veer Kaluri, she's a PhD student at Stanford. She's sort of done a great job really bringing a lot of these issues to the forefront and has written a little bit about this idea of just the reality that a lot of these AI systems or products end up empowering those that are already in power to sort of impose or potentially oppress those that are in less of a position to have agency on the situation. So this is kind of like, in my mind, almost a separate, like in my mind, I kind of have like two categories of issues. Like one is sort of situations where, you know, it's very problematic where that the AI product does not work. And that applies to situations where, you know, you have a facial recognition system that misidentifies, you know, a Black man. That man is already at greater risk of being, you know, targeted by the police. That's a technology that's disproportionately used on, you know, certain neighborhoods. So it puts him at greater risk, the fact that this technology does not work for him. But there's also this other situation that does exist of, you know, the technology being potentially harmful when it does work. And I think in those situations, especially, you really see these power dynamics play out. This was in the film, but also, you know, a case that at AJL we worked very closely with on the Atlantic Towers, and the residents that were sort of pushing back against the landlord trying to install facial recognition in their building. And you know, I was really affected by that case because it was a really interesting conversation that I had with them. Anytime I talked to any of the tenants that were part of the tenant association, you know, I would talk about like, oh, privacy, are you worried about that? They're like, no, like, you know, bias. Like they just saw those issues as peripheral to the lack of agency that, you know, this installation of facial recognition would instill upon their home, pretty much, and how they were worried that, you know, their landlord would weaponize that surveillance against them. And, you know, they took, you know, the fact that, you know, those that were creating these systems didn't bother to make it work on them, the fact that, you know, their data was being collected indiscriminately. They just took that as like further evidence that, you know, this technology wasn't created for me. It wasn't created for my benefit. And you know, I'm not able to push back against this. So, you know, I'm just, it's a lose situation for me. So, and they felt completely helpless at some point before they were really able to, you know, garner some support and really push forward a case and end up, you know, convincing the landlord through a lot of publicity and a lot of public pushback to not install that facial recognition system. So there are situations like this that do happen of, you know, the introduction of a machine learning system or of an algorithm just furthering, you know, the authority that a particular group has over another group, and that becoming a very sort of problematic dynamic. And in those situations, you know, the ideal is to have some level of participation and engagement from those that are affected, you know, to have some level of, to have some kind of governance process where those that are impacted by the introduction of this algorithm to be able to say like, oh, actually, this is not to our benefit. Like, we don't actually want this to be affecting our lives in the way that it's planned to be affecting us. And that's like a governance issue and a governance question, but definitely not something that the field realized until quite recently, that that's like a very common scenario, and something that needs to be part of the policy conversation as well, for sure.
Yeah, so I guess picking up on something that Adam mentioned is, I feel like there's sort of two spaces that we're talking about. We're talking about things like finance and healthcare, where things are already pretty regulated, and there may be issues with existing regulation, as as Adam pointed out. And then we have sort of the Wild West, which is, you know, sort of like Silicon Valley building whatever random technology they think is going to, you know, lead to the most engagement or the most ad clicks or something like that. And these feel to me like two fairly different things when I think about it from the perspective of like regulation related questions. And so I think you can, like, in answering this, I'd love if people pick whichever side of this you want, like that you feel like, you know, perhaps more about. But yeah, I'd love to hear what people think about sort of, you know, how we address regulation. Should we think of this in terms of audits? Should we think of this in terms of someone in the Q&A mentioned, for instance, having like an institute that would give certifications? And does this differ across these sort of two types of scenarios? So maybe we can start with Adam this time.
Yeah, absolutely. They are very different, and we work with companies on both sides of that of that divide. I will say there's been really fascinating. So the traditional regulated industries that have kind of been out of habit had to think about these issues or out of regulation, out of necessity for a long time. When I first started Arthur in 2018, they kind of cared about it from the beginning. Although there was a little bit of this sort of like, your tool shines a spotlight on what our algorithms are doing, and at first it was sort of like that creates risk for us because then we have to disclose and all these problems. And the tech companies, when we first started talking to them, 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, their response was sort of like, "Oh, it's not our problem. Like our systems are fine," and they just didn't believe that there was much of a problem. I think I think either Deborah or Nicole made the point recently that it's not just now in the last year or two what's happened with with a lot of these high profile incidents like the Apple Card incident, the Amazon one that was cited in the movie, and Black Lives Matters and things like that. Is there's these companies. Some of these companies are now sort of the threat of reputational risk that has become very real, and that's something that really is impactful to revenues and to business, and hire people don't want to work for these companies and things like that, and so they are taking it seriously. So it's been amazing in the last year to year and a half. Those tech companies who 2 years ago didn't want to hear about it, weren't interested, have now started reaching out to us saying all right, we got to take this seriously, and they've really sort of started to. There's still plenty that haven't, but we're starting to actually get inbound requests for hey, can you help us, which we didn't get before. And and on the enterprise side, it's gone from sort of doing what's required by the regulation and nothing more, to actually wanting to actually be much more thoughtful about it and do things. So that's why I'm really thankful for the people who are out there raising awareness and really bringing these issues to the forefront.
I mean, I'll chime in on the regulatory side. I think Adam is completely right. I mean, I think it's a mixed bag going back to the extent to which the determinations that come out of algorithms or the black box thinking is opaque. And so there's this desire to have that become more open, which many of us on this call know becomes quite problematic when there is proprietary data sets that are used. On the regulatory side, there's been conversation around, accessing data sets that are much more inclusive and representative. I've been working on this thing, and I think it was also kind of suggested in the movie. A couple of years ago, I went to buy a dishwasher. And when I went to buy this dishwasher, there was this big yellow tag on it that told me how much electricity, how much water this actually used. And in my experiences working with NIST, what I began to think about is, what if you were able to put a better housekeeping seal, or what I call an Energy Star rating, on the performance of algorithms, just based on that reputational risk, as well as the fact that you want people to have confidence in that. I'm sure every engineer that is on this call wants to be sure that they're building models with a high level of confidence. And it's so funny, in conversations I've had with companies where an algorithm is sort of played out to be discriminatory, the first thing they always say is, well, they didn't use the right confidence level, so that's why it's not working right. But the bottom line is, I get it, and there are certain optimization of models that should happen in a guidebook on that. But in the marketplace, where we're more driven by permissionless innovation, there's what I call permissionless forgiveness. If you break it, you say, I'm sorry, and you try again. Very different from what researchers do when we're handling human subjects. So I've been thinking about this idea of, what does it look like to have an Energy Star rating in algorithm, in managing algorithmic bias? I'm working on a piece for Oxford University Press for this. One, it has to have this best practices. I think Adam is completely right. Companies have now found that for them to actually compete in this ecosystem, that there are some things that they have to do. And I don't think it's a push towards self-regulation, but there's apparently not a compilation of best practices on how companies are actually testing on secondary or tertiary context, or the extent to which they actually ask questions before they automate a decision, or who has a seat at the table. I've been actually suggesting to people, you need to start there. Bring the right people around the table to determine if this is a decision that should be automated in the first place, and what the potential risks are. Sort of that risk-based assessment before you actually go to trial. With that being the case, in my Energy Star rating, there's a place for public policy. What do policymakers mostly care about? They care about civil rights, they care about accountability, and they care that people are not having opportunities for a close on that. But guess what? Policymakers are not scientists, so they don't even know how to look at algorithms from the perspective of putting traditional regulation on top of that. So I've been sort of suggesting, how do we have conversations or multi-stakeholder engagement around this? I've recently said on a radio show that we should have a commission under the Biden administration to look at issues like this, because it's obviously seeping into all aspects of human life. But what's more importantly to me, and it's been part of my model, just like I was drawn to that yellow sticker, I think that civil society doesn't play a huge role when we're looking at public interest technology. And I think there's an opportunity to have some type of feedback loop. If there is a technology that does not perform well on me, I should be able to tell you. And if there's an opportunity to co-develop it, just like we did with fintech, perhaps the companies should go and get regulatory guidance on ways that they can actually develop better products. I guess what I'm saying is we're at a state now where algorithms are everywhere, and they're everywhere, my friends, because there's no privacy standard in the United States whatsoever that sort of limits what people can collect about you. So look at what's happening with the COVID vaccine, look at who's not getting it, and it just simply repeats the same type of systemic inequalities, which to me is quite disturbing, because that means that people will constantly be subjected to misinformation, disinformation, racism. But this is the interesting thing I'm saying here. When we look at regulation too, I think the other thing that we're somewhat missing, which has really come to me to be really dear to my research, is that this economy is really strong. And by that, I mean, we don't even know that we sit in an algorithmic bubble oftentimes, because we're not certain how these models work as citizens. And when we think about, for example, social media platforms, our likes, affinities, and interests, we don't know that we're not seeing the likes, affinity, and interests, like in my case, white supremacists or other. And so I think going forward, it's worth having, again, these interdisciplinary conversations about this. I worry about too much regulation because I think the innovation as a digital divide specialist, I'm writing a book on this, shameless plug, about the digital divide and the impact of technology on underserved communities. But technology is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. So we've either got to get this right in a multi-stakeholder, cross-discipline conversation, or we've got to get this right in ways that we just totally put a stop on it because we feel it's going to harm people. And I think from the movie, that's really what I left it with. Like, where do we toe the line so we ensure that people still maintain their dignity and respect of the things that they fought for, while still being able to benefit from the technology that in many respects is now the new online economy. Nobody's going in. I mean, look at vaccinations. You can't even get it unless you have a computer. So I think we have to have that realization going forward that these are here to stay.
Yeah, maybe I can.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, no, go ahead.
So maybe I can just jump in with just a couple of sentences, picking up on Nicole, because she mentioned the engineers in the audience, and just if you think back 5 years, like there wasn't a chapter in a data mining book on machine learning bias and algorithmic fairness. It just wasn't. And so to the engineers that are listening to us, and it's such a big issue, they might be thinking, oh my God, how do I start? So how do we start? So here's the practical advice from the educator in the group. So the first step would be, break down the performance of your algorithm. So whatever you're doing, whether it's data you got of Kaggle or your own data within your organization, start breaking up the performance of the algorithm. That's like the basic, most primitive step to make sure, okay, it looks okay, at least on the surface, right? So next step, okay, if you have satisfied that on your training data, which is retrospective and represents and reflects the past, which is not necessarily the future we want to build, but that acknowledged, if you put the algorithm, into production, start small and really monitor it. So not only in terms of performance, but on the impact on who the algorithm affects, like both Nicole and Deb have so eloquently talked about. And then once it starts, if you're satisfied with that, and you want to deploy it at a full scale, have a plan in place. So what are you monitoring and how? What are the risks? And when are you going to sound the alarm? If you see something that's unusual, what are you going to do and when? So those would be my kind of points to get started to address this, because as I said, it wasn't in our textbooks 5 years ago.
Deb, did you want to add something?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna I totally agree with. I just want to briefly respond to that point and then make the point I was gonna make. I agree with sort of Adam and Margrét's point around this is a relatively new topic of interest. I remember in 2017, 2018, when I was recently learning about this topic. One of the reasons that like drove me to like identify and like find joy and start working with her was because I couldn't find a lot of other people working on this at all. And I remember, being really frustrated with that. At the company where I was at, so one of my first sort of introductions to this topic was just, being a Black woman working on a facial recognition product as part of this company's sort of, client list of, models to build. I remember looking through the training set and then realizing like, oh my gosh, there's no one that looks like me in here. And then looking through all the academic training sets and seeing like, oh, okay, this is like an actual problem and an actual issue. And at the time I tried to have a conversation with my manager at the time about it. And he was sort of like, his response was like, it's so hard to get data, no one talks about this, this isn't a real issue. And it was just coming out of this place of like, no one's having this conversation. What are you talking about? What are you saying? And I felt like super, frustrated by that. And Joy was the only, I try to tell people it's not a coincidence that me, Timnit, and Joy are all, Black women. Like, I think we were trying to vocalize some of these issues to those that were around us. And, unfortunately at the time, it was just an issue that was easily dismissed because no one really believed that it was a problem until, you're seeing these data sets and you're like, I'm not in here, what's going on? So that's definitely something that I think will lead us to better regulation down the line, is the fact that, finally it's a conversation that's, I'm incredibly happy to hear that these companies are coming to you and other, audit companies like you, where, in the past also, when we had the first iteration of Gender Shades, when Joy had like written letters to all of these companies informing them about the audit results, it was like pure dismissal across the board. And then they were incredibly upset that they were on, that they were in the New York Times later on, and we're like, well, we shared everything with you. All of this information was sent directly to like, whoever needed to know. Multiple copies were sent, but it was just such a dismissed problem for so long that I think now that it's finally a public conversation, I'm hoping that it's also finally on the radar of, policymakers. It's finally on the radar of those developing regulation, and hopefully we can move forward in a way that's actually significant. I wanted to comment on this like dichotomy that you mentioned, Hal, of like, the wild Silicon Valley West and more regulated areas. I think both of them have incredible limitations to how they think about algorithmic accountability. In the Wild West, we have some of these like, I would consider like a lot of hiring AI tools, like employment anti-discrimination is definitely a thing, and there's a lot of regulation in that space, but it's very loose regulation. And a lot of these like, hiring or recruiting tools, or it's regulation in terms of like, oh, you can't, dismiss someone or reject an application based off of race, but that doesn't affect like recruiting. So a lot of like LinkedIn and other algorithms that are for recruiting, or assessment in other ways, like defining personality tests for employment. Like that's just kind of like this crazy industry where no one is really looking, and they have all kinds of things that they will claim to be AI and will market and will sell out. And in those spaces, I definitely see the issue of bias being real, but there's also just the issue of, false advertising, where they'll make a claim that, you fill out this questionnaire and that's supposed to indicate your effectiveness as a worker, that there's, a lot of ridiculousness in that space and in other spaces of that type. And I think regulation will have to actually reckon with the fact that they have a false advertising issue in addition to the bias issue. They have a lot of just integrity issues in these sort of Wild West domains that might be less of a concern in the more regulated domains, where at minimum it kind of has to work, because that's something that you are evaluated for. And then in the regulated domains, I see like, and this is just because I got involved in a project involving an algorithm that's sort of part of a healthcare system, a healthcare process. And I'm realizing, yeah, the FDA is quite thorough and has a lot of documentation requirements. But there's also a lot of loopholes that exist for algorithmic tools, because they might have frameworks for thinking about very recently developed frameworks where they're like, oh yeah, medical devices can also be software devices, and very recently coming on to terms with that. But then now having to also come to terms with, well, some of these software devices are really, machine learning models, and data is this huge thing that has all of these questions associated with it that you haven't asked about in the documentation. So you can have someone with, data that's quite biased that can get through some of these FDA requirements, and that's happened a couple of times already. So yeah, I think you have this issue of like the regulated spaces at minimum requiring documentation and some level of transparency and some level of integrity, but often sort of falling short of catching up to where machine learning is just technology-wise, since everything's moving so quickly and regulation is so slow. But then on the other hand, you have this sort of wild west where there's nothing, like there's no documentation, no integrity, no accountability. And I feel like those are incredibly dangerous as well. Unfortunately, the Silicon Valley Wild West stuff makes it into the news all the time. Like, my parents are always like, have you heard of this? No, I don't want to hear about any AI. Now they know not to approach me, but it's just kind of, you have everyone, even people that, don't even identify with the space, couldn't care less about algorithms, reading headlines about, oh, AI can do this and AI can do that, and really, falling for that Silicon Valley narrative. And I think that can also be really dangerous from like a public perception issue and a public understanding issue. And it makes it very difficult for them to participate in these conversations around the risks and the, and bias and things like that. So yeah, risks on all sides effectively. It's a huge mess across the board, but especially on the Silicon Valley side, I'd say.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we're basically out of time, even though there's like 100 more questions that we could go through. And I would love to hear everyone's answer to all of them. One thing that I'd like to do just in wrap up is to give each panelist just a minute or two to talk about something that actually Nicole brought up at the very beginning. So I actually wrote this down. So Nicole made this comment that she just worked on the longest paper of her life because she was working with an engineer that, they just couldn't agree, right? And I think that like one thing that I love about this panel is that, there's people from the nonprofit space, from the education space, from the corporate space, and also, people from different disciplinary backgrounds, right? And so I think there are a lot of questions in the chat broadly around this question of like, how do we work together? Because I think one thing that's become clear in this discussion is that like, if we want to make progress, we really have to work together across all of these boundaries. And so we'll start with, I think Deb is actually we've now modded the length of the list. And so, yeah, can you just say a little bit, just a minute or two about, how you've been most effective working across whatever boundary you think is, you want to talk about?
Yeah, and I actually recently wrote a paper about like how education did not prepare me to work across boundaries. So I was trained as an engineer in school and professionally, and I feel like I had like this huge sort of learning curve with respect to how to actually do interdisciplinary work. And I feel like it is a skill that you need to acquire. You need to like understand new vocabularies and figure out how to translate between different communities. And I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity at the AI Now Institute to just be surrounded by people of different disciplines that really taught me a lot of how to bridge this gap. So in my mind, it's really just actually spending time in close proximity, doing work with people of different perspectives from different disciplines with different viewpoints. I recently worked on a project where, there was a journalist on the team, and that was just like a very different perspective and different set of priorities and different methodology and things like that. So I think that exposing yourself to this through actual sort of collaborations or just interactions is really the first step of us making progress on this problem, because I do see it as an interdisciplinary problem. I don't think engineering can solve it on its own. Or any other discipline can kind of solve it on its own. It will require this sort of cross-disciplinary collaboration. So hopefully, people can jump into more of those collaborations together, and that's how we move forward together.
Thanks, Deb. Margrét?
Sure, so I can just echo everything that Deb said. And a lot of my healthcare work has been centered around the clinicians all the time. So it's working across these boundaries, and it takes time to, you know, that's the, you know, so it's so easy to kind of be stuck in your own algorithmic world, then you can, you know, publish those papers much faster. But to actually have real impact, you have to reach across the boundaries and establish the trust and work together. And it takes, you know, double the time, but, you know, hopefully you also double the impact. So, but I know I only have a minute and we're over time. So we've been talking a lot about the kind of the dark side of AI. So I just wanted to kind of leave on a kind of brighter note, maybe. So we've been talking a lot about the different impacts, especially in healthcare, people analytics. So just to mention one study that just came out that actually showed that in a population of diabetes, a clinical decision support system actually helped eradicate the racial differences in complications of diabetes. So we are also getting some things right, and we need to champion that as well while we work on the other things.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point, that you know, we should raise up this work that does that does good. Yeah. Go ahead, Nicole.
So I was going to say to everybody, in the interest of time, what I said yesterday on a panel with lawyers. Every person on this call should have a good friend who's a social scientist. That's it. And I just say that, you know, in jest, but I also say it in seriousness, because I think, you know, there's so many things that we can learn from one another. I just want to go back to what Margaret said around, you know, this wasn't in the handbook. Well, guess what? In the sociological handbooks, it wasn't anything about artificial intelligence. So one of the things that we could learn from each other is just about the settled research that's happened prior to the advent of technology that can help us understand a lot of these disparities. So I think if we combine that with interdisciplinary conversations, and to Adam's point, you know, private sector conversations with public sector, and we didn't talk about government today, but even where government fits in terms of responsible AI, I think we'll get closer to the mark.
Thanks. And Adam, do you want to wind us up?
Sure. Yeah, and I would just agree with a lot of the points that were made here. I think that, you know, you have these wildly different groups, right? Like government regulators, advocates, sociologists, you have engineers. And I think that it's been kind of a bumpy road to start with getting these groups talking. And there's been times where, you know, the engineers, the practitioners felt vilified. And there's parts where the advocates didn't feel like their voices were being taken seriously. And it's caused some, you know, there's been some bumps in the road. But overall, I think things are coming together. Like people are starting to learn how to communicate and kind of understand each other's perspectives more. And I do feel like it's things are like those groups are all kind of coming together now for a much more meaningful discourse and realizing they all have a really important role to play in ensuring a really good future.
All right, wonderful. So thank you everyone for joining us and staying 10 minutes over time. A huge thank you to all the panelists. I feel like I learned a lot. I'm gonna go back and watch the recording because I feel like I was spending all my time taking notes and not paying as much attention as I wished. Kate just posted a link if you have feedback about this. Unfortunately, we're not physically together, so I'm going to applaud the panelists on behalf of the, you know, a couple hundred people who are in the audience.